Welcome to the latest installment of Series 66, our journey through the Bible one book at a time. We're looking at each book of the Bible as it relates to the rest of the story and the whole story of God for us. Today, we land in the book of Daniel. Daniel is one of the prophets of the Old Testament, but it also is a book of history because it takes place during the Babylonian exile. This, of course, was when the nation of Babylon came to Jerusalem, destroyed the city, and removed many of its residents back to Babylon. This was the second exile in the history of the Jewish people, and it was a significant and important time in understanding God's promises and God's provision for his people. Now, the book of Daniel is full of stories that you and I know very well, or at least have heard them for years. Of course, the most famous one, and we think of Daniel in the lion's den, where he stood up to the king and was placed in the den of a lion, thinking that he would be ripped apart, but he was there safe for many days and was able to tame the lions with his faith. We also know of three friends who were placed into the fiery furnace. These three friends, of course, have difficult names to pronounce, as many Old Testament characters do. But I love how the VeggieTales tell that story, and it is the adventures of Rak, Shak, and Benny. And so I invite you to look at that in Daniel chapter 3. But today I want to specifically look at a story that's found in the first chapter of Daniel, and it tells us about King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king over Babylon, and when his armies defeated the Israelites and moved many into his country, he asked his officials to gather together some of the Israelite men who were known to be of great potential. Those who were smart, those who were educated, those who were strong and good looking. And his job was, or his goal, Nebuchadnezzar said to his officials, was to take these men and to train them up in the ways of the Babylonians, to learn their history, their language, their literature, all of this, and even in the ways of fighting, so that after 3 years, these men would now be in the king's service and act as a mediator between the Israelites and the Babylonians. And his goal was to merge the two cultures, communities, and ultimately become stronger. And so, among those who were chosen was Daniel and the three characters I mentioned to you earlier, Rak, Shak, and Benny. And Daniel, of course, receives a new name. These other three also had new names, and their new names was what we know of today. But Daniel continues to be called by his given Israelite name. His Babylonian name was a little bit hard to pronounce, but it's found in chapter 1. You can go and try it for yourself. But as they are collected and selected, they are given an opportunity to be trained in the ways of the Babylonians. And one way that they are groomed or trained is by receiving food from the king's table. In chapter 1, we learned that these four friends decide that they don't want to be defiled by the king's food, and so they request only vegetables and water. And so the official who's in charge of watching after them and training them is a little bit afraid to do this for them, because they're afraid that if they only eat vegetables and water and all the others, men that are being trained, would eat of the king's food, that the men who are eating the king's food would be strong and vital and be great because the king had given it to them, and those that would just eat vegetables would look weak and strained. So Daniel gives a proposition to the guard. He says, "Give us vegetables and water for 10 days. And then check our condition. If we are weak and less than presentable, then you can treat us accordingly. You can either give us the king's food or kill us and push us away." And so after 10 days, it was revealed that these four friends were stronger and more well-equipped than those who had been eating the choice food from the king's table. And so the result is a couple of things. First of all of those who were eating the king's food now were given vegetables, thinking that was going to be the key to make all of them strong and happy. But the second thing that happens is that Daniel and his three friends, these four men of Israel, gain insight and respect amongst those who are training them. And eventually, they come before the king and they're accepted into the king's service. But another lesson we learn from this story is that oftentimes we are told by the world how it is that we should act and how we should live, but God often has an alternative. And one of the challenging things about following God is listening to God over culture. We live in a world today where the cultural voices are loud, and the things that are always pushed upon us confuse us about what God wants from us and for us. And so as we read through the book of Daniel, we see other examples of how Daniel remained faithful and how his friends remained faithful even in the face of pressure to do what the king was saying over and against what God was saying. So my friends, today we have an opportunity to listen to the world or listen to God. But when we listen to God, our lives will certainly be different. The challenges of living a godly life are always before us, but the rewards are indeed great. We have a fulfilled and a full life because of leading what God has directed and called for us. And Daniel teaches us this example of what faithfulness looks like. I encourage you, I invite you to look at the book of Daniel, to see him as an example of how it is that you and I can also be an influence in the world, that when we live a godly life, our lives flow with the grace of God, and others are changed and transformed through that power. I hope this helps you today, and I invite you to open up the book of Daniel as you continue your exploration of God's holy word. God bless you, and have a great day.